50 minutes is never quite enough. So what I've tried to do is really tease out 4 key insights, 4 key really practical insights that you can sort of take away and use in your mentoring. But the first question, I'd just love to ask everybody one question before we get going, and that is, how is your brain doing this week? If you have 1 word or 2 words to describe it, what would you say? I think if I said mine, it's probably fairly frazzled, but if I could go around the room, Joanna, what would you say?
I think full. Full and a bit tired.
Yeah. Rack?
Yeah, I'm not too far from there. It's going at 100 miles an hour at the moment.
Yeah. What about you, Sarah?
Yeah, lots of stretch and challenge to the brain this week, with a general backdrop of needing more energy, I think.
Yeah. And Dominique?
Yeah, challenge. I think I'm learning more about my new role for the new year, so I'm like in that stage where you're like, ah. So yeah, challenged.
Brain feels like overload. And Jane?
Bursting.
Sorry, I missed
Today.
that.
Bursting. Christmas, work, away days. It's bursting this week.
Yeah.
Glad it's Friday.
Totally relate. And what about you, Stuart?
Mine feels ready to disconnect for a couple of days from work stuff to focus on all that other stuff that's impending for December.
Yeah. And Jude?
I think thoughtful, responsibilities, learning, all of those things. Yeah, and a bit tired.
Yeah. Well,
it's Friday.
Hopefully this session will sort of address some of those things. Let me just start by sharing my screen. Just give me a second. Okay. So this is the talk, Mentoring for the Brain. And this is a slightly quirky idea that I want to introduce you to first of all, is kind of, I'd like you to imagine that the mentoring that you're going to be giving to these people in these 3 sessions you're going to be giving is a real opportunity to give their brain a spa. It's something, you know, based on what you've all been saying, that we all kind of need right now, but mentoring is a real opportunity to sort of rejuvenate the brain, to consider new ways of doing things, to kind of step back from our always on culture. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to tell you why mentoring can be such a positive thing for the brain and how you can make sure that you make it as positive as possible. The first thing is about pressing pause. Our brains really thank us when we press pause. There's something about our kind of super busy, always on culture that is completely at odds with the way that our brains operate optimally and effectively. The part of our brains that we use on a kind of day-to-day basis for our working lives is our prefrontal, we use all of it, but our prefrontal cortex is responsible for our rational thinking, our creative thinking, our problem-solving capability. And what happens when we're in a kind of multitasking space is our brains just can't handle it, because we need to have one thing to focus on at a time. So I want to show you, if you look at this slide, can anybody just sort of tell me what they see?
2 people facing each other.
People, yeah.
Do you see anything else?
Vase.
Yeah, a vase. And can you see both things at the same time? Or do you can? What about anyone else?
I switch.
Flip, yeah, switch.
Yeah, switch.
Yeah. And that's definitely the case. That what happens for me as well is that I can't hold the image of 2 men and a vase in my head at the same time. I'm literally toggling between the 2. And this is a really important thing to understand about our brains. When we're using our prefrontal cortex, the area of our brain that's responsible for our higher thinking, we can't handle kind of 2 conscious thoughts at the same time. Our brains are much better at coping with one. There's some amazing research that's been done by a scientist called Harold Pashler, and he's done a lot of work on looking at how brain productivity is affected when we do 2 conscious tasks at once. And he says it can literally reduce the capacity of the human brain from the level of somebody who's got a Harvard MBA to an 8-year-old, quite simply by asking somebody to do 2 conscious tasks at once. So why am I telling you all this? I'm telling you all this because mentoring is a really amazing opportunity to kind of shine a spotlight on one issue at a time, to really encourage your mentees to kind of step away from the day-to-day and really start using their brains optimally by tackling one challenge at a time, not lots of challenges at a time. And so how does this apply in the kind of mentoring space? Well, the first thing that I would say is what's really important when you meet your mentee, and perhaps even beforehand, is to drop them a note and just ask them, just tell me what's on your mind. What are you thinking about? How can I help you? Because this process of really getting them to focus in on kind of one thing is going to be really beneficial in terms of giving their brain that capacity just to have a bit of a brain spa moment and just go, okay, I'm going to focus in on one thing. I'm going to have that opportunity to talk it over with a person. And I would also really encourage you with each session that you run. Often, I find particularly in coaching, but I know in mentoring too, that goals can change over time. So it's kind of the perfect first question to ask at the beginning of a mentoring session is, how can I help you? I wanted to just stop the screen share for a moment and just so that I can see everybody. But I just wondered how that sits, what people are thinking. Does that sort of resonate with you in terms of what works best in a mentoring relationship?
Yeah, I think I'm reflecting that time out to give some quality time to problems is definitely very valuable. It's made me reflect on making sure that the meeting comes at the right time for both parties to give it that full attention, and also reflecting with the challenge of staying, there's probably going to be multiple things, and so the challenge is to stay really focused on something to dive into in depth.
Yeah,
I think at the moment it can be quite hard to pick out your one thing straight away. Certainly when I'm working with my coach at the moment, we are spending a bit of time at the beginning of the session having a download or a chit chat, and her skill is to pick the connections in what I'm downloading and to find the theme and then to play it back to me, and to ask those open questions about, well, so perhaps it is, and often it's something I didn't think it was, and maybe that's just my lack of awareness, but sometimes I think it's one thing and it's actually something else. So I would not want to close down too early, I guess is what I'm saying, because you can end up, and sometimes you come on to the real issue anyway through the discussion, I guess. Yeah,
no, I think that's really true. And often I find that if people don't know exactly what they want to talk about, the next best question after how can I help you is just what's on your mind. And it's that sort of opening, that big funneling question that gets people going, oh, okay, and then it's from that range of things that you can then say, and what would be most valuable for you to focus on.
Yeah, I've found in the past, Sarah, using that question, you almost get two extremes of an answer. Either it's a struggle and it needs further research because at the time everyone thinks, well, I don't know how you can help me, or actually it becomes like opening the floodgates and it's okay, let's try and structure this and get to the nub of the issue. So it's interesting to see those two responses to that question.
Yeah,
I think it's important as well to put this in the context of the program as well, because the participants are going through a lot of webinars and talks and self-reflection and reading, and they'll be reflecting. So I think this is even more key, because it's not just a normal day job. They're getting a lot of input, and I think helping them understand what to focus on, because you know what it's like when you're going in that developmental stage, you're going, I need this, I need this, I need this. So how do we help them to really focus on what is going to have the maximum value for them, or the thing that's most on their mind, with all of this input coming in as well?
Absolutely. Right, I'm just conscious of time, so I'm going to take us back into the presentation and take us on to the next point, which is again playing into this brain spa idea. The real benefit of mentoring for a mentee is enabling them to really step back and see the bigger picture, to get out of the detail and see this bigger picture. So what I wanted to do, if everybody's got pen and paper with them, to really illustrate this point, I just wanted to do a quick exercise with everybody. So if you could just copy this out onto a piece of paper in front of you. Obviously, because I've got a dark blue screen, it makes it slightly confusing, but the dark blue is essentially your paper. And what I want you to do is just shade in the smaller squares that in the middle of the boxes.
Our brains are tired.
It's honestly a super quick one. And I promise you'll find it fun.
Promise. Drawing.
Oh, okay, the drawing bit, yeah. Are we ready? I can only see 3 faces, but 3 faces are looking at me. So yeah. So the first thing I'd love everybody to do is just look at box A and just draw a line across the box, which enables you to split the dark blue areas on my screen, the white areas on your piece of paper, into 2 equally sized spaces. So it's pretty simple. It should look something like this. So with box B, similar thing. I'd like you to divide this box into the dark area of the box into 3 equally sized spaces. Which should look something like this. Box C, could you divide it into 4 equally sized spaces? This is where the Friday afternoon vibe might slightly challenge us. Any luck? Yeah? Shall I show you the answer? This is the answer.
No, I didn't get that. To be fair.
No.
No,
There's
no way I got this on my first time of doing it either. So now for box D, I'd like you to divide the space into 7 equally sized spaces, please. How's everyone doing? Shall I show you the answer? Yeah? Yeah, so it's funny, isn't it? You look at it and you're like, oh, well, of course. But what's happened here is that the experiment has primed your brain to be looking for a more difficult answer than is actually there. That we get, and this is the way our brains work, we get quite focused into solving a problem, and we use the same thinking to keep solving the problem, and we can get really stuck down a particular channel of thinking, and it becomes really difficult to kind of step back and see things differently. So it's almost like our thoughts are sort of like this car traveling one way along a bridge without any opportunity to kind of step out or step differently. And this is the idea that I kind of want to introduce you to, that mentoring, in terms of like following up with this brain spa theme, we might have a goal of reaching that big tree on the horizon, but if we're on a 4-wheel drive, we don't have to take, this path. We can really kind of take different paths, go off into the field, go off to the copse of trees on the far right. And it's often when we enable our brains to have that moment, when we enable our mentees to have that time to just kind of step back out of the everyday, really focused thinking and step back, that's when we start making the sort of broader connections between our brains, between the thinking that we're doing, to help us to kind of reach insights, reach new insights, develop new knowledge along the way. So we're better equipped when we do reach our goal to then tackle the next one. So how does this apply? One of the things that I think is really important with a mentoring relationship, and it's the same for coaching too, is like helping your mentee to potentially identify those brain blocks that they're coming up against. Those challenges that are making them not achieve what they want to achieve, or hitting a roadblock and not knowing how to get around that roadblock. And where you can really benefit your mentees' thinking is sort of encouraging them to kind of challenge that thinking, giving them that opportunity to step back from the everyday and ask them questions about, you know, what's holding them back, what's stopping them, and then starting to, if they're really big things, starting to sort of encourage them to see them from a different perspective, or challenge their own thinking. Because often what we do is we get caught into a sort of web of thinking in our mind that convinces us that we can't do a certain thing, or that something's blocking us because of X. And the opportunity that we have as a mentor is to really help somebody to kind of challenge that thinking and open up their thinking and use our experience to do that. I'd love to just kind of open back up to everybody again. It's nice to see everybody's face. And just ask, you know, what that makes you think in relation to mentoring, and whether there's something you've noticed in the past with mentoring or coaching your teams.
I think it's probably a bit of a struggle for those of us who are used to solving problems to ask the open question and to coach, helping people find their own path, rather than telling them, look, just go through that cornfield over there, go towards that tree. Actually allowing for self-discovery. So I consciously have to remind myself to do that whenever I'm in a coaching situation, that it's not mine to solve. They will look to me potentially, particularly if they're people in my team, to provide a solution, but the growth comes from, as you say, helping them identify, helping them, asking the right questions, being there, being open and being supportive, as opposed to trying to necessarily show the way all the time. So I think that's perhaps sometimes it's appropriate, but
I think that's a really good point, and actually giving them a structure to help them navigate out of whatever the blocks are is what I've found most successful in the past, is not necessarily helping them identify those things, but then giving them a structure to solve them.
I also think the success of that is almost how successful you've been in phase one, which is kind of removing distractions so that they can open their mind. And I think if you've still got distractions, you know, that sometimes really prevents them moving to that place of openness. Yeah.
And I think it's certainly true, like somebody else was saying just now about kind of timings of meetings too. Like I had a meeting at 5 o'clock last night, and I sort of kicked myself afterwards thinking, why did I have it at that time? Because neither of us were in a productive state. And it's just not an ideal time to encourage that kind of more meandering style of thinking. But I also think that, you know, there's, you know, playing to Jude's point there, there's a real difference here. Obviously I'm a coach, but there is a difference here between the coaching and the mentoring relationship. And, you know, part of the different value that a mentor brings is bringing their skills to the equation and telling the mentee about situations that they've been in before and how they've tackled the same problems. So I don't for a minute want to suggest that that isn't an essential part of the mentoring process. I just want to kind of introduce that idea that sometimes the brain can get blocked quite easily, and just stepping back a little bit and encouraging more broader thinking actually almost will give your mentee more choices and more options, and a greater feeling of sort of power and choice over what they want to do for the future. Has anyone got any other points, or should we move on?
It's almost, and I use this expression in a different way, it's uncovering people's personal and unconscious, a lot of the time, the bias of their own limitations as well. I can't do that because of Y. I could never do X because of this. And so when I say unconscious bias, I don't mean in the way that we've, you know, used to hearing it. It's almost like a personal unconscious bias that you're not. And I think being the mentor and being able to remove those blocks and taking away the excuse almost, I think is quite key as well. So if that wasn't in your way, you know, blah, blah, you know, etc. But that, just to get your thoughts on that, would be great.
I think that's it's such an important way to tackle, to talk to people, is, and that question as well, if that wasn't a problem, what would you do? Because it enables them just for a minute to put that block down and just go, oh, what are all the opportunities if I didn't have this massive thing in my head that's stopping me from doing it because I'm scared of something or something's holding me back. And just having that time to kind of look out onto the wider horizon is a great way of helping people to overcome those blocks. Anyone else have any thoughts on that?
No, I think we're good.
No?
We have a handy little mnemonic that I use a lot with my team in Nando's, ETC. So somebody's struggling or stuck or feeling something, it's like, what's the emotion? So what, can you name it? What is it? What's triggering this? And then what's true? So is that true? So what you're describing to me, they said this, they did that, I don't think they'll do such and such a thing. What's the truth of it? And then what are your choices? So what choice can you make? And that I guess is to try and get people out of the fight or flight and back into the thinking space again, back into executive functioning. Well, let's just remove the emotion for a minute, have a think about what really is true, so that we can stop catastrophizing and making up stories, and actually think, right now, what are your choices? Which is a little bit, I think, Joanna, about what you were saying around just that is the blocker. So your brain is providing loads of really helpful adrenaline in case you get attacked by a saber-toothed tiger, but that's not happening. So what's actually true? And then what choice can you make? I have to remind myself of that a lot, but it's just helpful to have that ETC for me.
Yeah, it sounds like a really really powerful way of looking at it, and I think it also really plays into sort of brain biology, when you know that like states of high emotion and the feeling of kind of high threat actually impacts the capacity of your entire brain to function effectively. I don't know if you've heard of something called like the amygdala hijack, but it's it's the fight or flight reaction essentially. But it's this idea that when we're taken over by a state of high emotion, the supply of glucose and energy to the sort of higher thinking parts of our brain, the parts that are responsible for rational thinking and creative thinking, actually gets shut down. So bizarrely, at the very time when you need all your brain resources, you're not capable of accessing them, which is why that model is such a good one, because you're literally going, okay, by labeling the emotion, it helps to reduce it. And then you can consider how true it is and then take choices off the back of it.
Right. To practice it though, it's like a muscle. If you don't use it, it doesn't develop. So remembering to practice it and keep using it in the moment.
Yeah, no, it's so true. Right, I'm going to go back to my screen. So, and this plays into a bit of what we've been talking about, but what I'd love to kind of share with you is a few insights about how you can support learning with your mentees. If you're going to have 3 hours with your mentee, but actually if you want to have a kind of a longer term impact, the single best way that you can do that is to support their learning. And I don't know if you've heard of a term called neuroplasticity. Is that familiar to anyone? Mm-hmm. It's just essentially this idea that our brains get rewired and rewired throughout our lives. And the best way I found of describing it is comparing, bizarrely, a giraffe and a human child. So a giraffe is born into the world within 30 minutes, it's capable of walking and standing up. Whereas a human baby, it takes up to a year or 2 years sometimes for the child to be able to learn to walk. And there's a reason for that. It's because our brains as humans, when we're born, are literally a blank canvas. Like, we arrive in the world as an extraordinary sort of bundle of potential that isn't yet achieved. And what happens as we kind of make our way through life is we start building connections in our brains. So our brains are home to 100 billion neurons, the cells that kind of make up our brain. And each neuron is capable of making 10,000 connections with different neurons. And it's the maps that are created between the neurons which guides our thinking, our feeling, our emotions, and ultimately that guides our behavior. And this is a process that the really powerful thing about neuroplasticity is it's a process that we keep engaging in throughout life. We don't just stop learning when we hit 18. Our brains are constantly rewiring themselves. So it's quite an interesting thought to consider that your brains right now are ever so slightly different to the way they were you know, half an hour ago when we started this conversation, just because of the hopefully new things you've learned and the new connections that you've made. And that's a really powerful thing to think about when you're in a mentoring relationship, because a brain can actually change in the course of a conversation. So the idea that I want to introduce you to is that, you know, that those conversations that you have with your mentee, you know, you're there to help kind of build and support them in terms of building those networks and those maps. And if you can really see yourself as a thinking partner in enabling them to do that, to really enabling them to sort of delve into those maps, challenge the maps that are perhaps limiting their thinking, as Joanna was referring to before, and, you know, really helping them to magnify the ones that are valuable to them. Like, how can they play to their strengths? What can they do that's going to support them going forward? And I know I kind of, as I'm saying it, I'm thinking some of this is quite obvious. It's like, you know, building somebody's strengths, or, you know, helping them to get around challenges. But what really matters in the brain is attention. What you pay attention to builds those connections in your head. So if you pay attention to your fears or your challenges or your problems, those maps and those networks become bigger, and they become more, they play out more frequently in your brain. Whereas if you can start paying attention to the things that you want to achieve instead of the things you are scared of, then it's those networks that start getting fueled, and you start fueling the capability for people to do new things. So how does this apply? The key things are, and again, it plays back to what we were just saying just now about the difference between the sort of mentoring relationship and the coaching relationship. It's really important in the mentoring space, obviously, that you're sharing your knowledge, sharing your experience, and helping people to really talk through the issues or challenges they face. But this is where, if your mentee, for example, comes to you with an issue or challenge that it's not one that you've faced before, or you haven't got any particular advice for them, this is why the open questions can be really valuable. So the questions that avoid a yes/no answer. So it's like, how could you do this? What have you tried before? All of those sorts of things. The closed questions are more things like, have you tried this? Something like that, which is kind of, it's specifically suggesting, oh, you must do this thing. But if you're thinking about trying to support them with a challenge that you don't particularly have experience in, or that you want to encourage them to kind of really activate those learning networks, it's the open questions that can be really valuable. Let me just come out of share for a minute and just see what everybody thinks of that, the kind of the neuroplasticity part, and how our brains can sort of rewire themselves throughout life. Has anyone got any sort of comments in terms of how this might be relevant in terms of supporting somebody to learn better?
One of the guys that I mentor at the moment, he was having a problem with his line manager, effectively, and he wanted to own a space of development, and he didn't feel like she was going to enable it. She's got quite a sort of controlling leadership style. And the way that we got around it, we talked about it so much, and the way we got around it was trying to think about this connections thing, was trying to make a connection to where he wanted to get to. So I said to him, well, let's talk about all the different things that you could try, and let's say what's the best and the worst that could happen in each of those scenarios, and then work through, you know, which one you think you can try. And some of the worst ones he'd already tried, and he was like, I can't go there again. I was like, okay, well, let's try making that connection to where you want to get to, what that would look like, and what the different routes would be to get there, and the best and worst that could happen kind of really helped him, actually. And he was, in the end, he was like, actually, the worst that could happen has probably already happened, because, you know, I've gone away and felt pretty dreadful and not really enjoyed the experience. So actually, I haven't got anything to risk now. I can just actually go on the front foot. So it was, I think, for him, making the connection to where he wanted to get to was quite an important conversation, because I think he was stuck on the what do I do rather than where I want to get to.
I love the concept that your brain can be different at the end of your mentoring session. Mm-hmm. It is at the beginning.
Yeah, nice.
I think we've all heard about strengths-based leadership and all that kind of stuff, but joining the dots between it's what we pay attention to that builds the networks, that's a sort of bit of a light bulb for me, and making the link between learning and why it's so important to focus on, as much and reinforcing the things that are going well and things that are good, as a mental health habit for everybody. It's been a good moment for me.
It's a real thing as well. And something I often share with people is my eldest son has ADHD, and his brain's firing all the time in all different directions. It's very hard for him to connect the dots, and his synapses don't have a chemical called dopamine to literally transfer the signal between two neurons. So for him, he gets so much negative feedback. So he gets 7 times as much negative feedback as a non-ADHD child, because he's always scatterbrained and all over the place. Sit down, concentrate, don't shout out, stop spinning around, all that kind of stuff. He's off. So what we've been advised to do, as well as sort of treating him medically, is to do positive reinforcement. So the psychologist said to us, imagine a cornfield, a little bit like that photograph you showed us, Sarah. Yeah. If you run down the middle of the cornfield once and you turn around and look back, you won't really see anything. You won't see any difference, maybe a couple of stalks knocked over. You run back the same way and you turn around, you'll start to see a few more. And if you keep doing that, eventually there's a path. The person who's never practicing the same thing because they're getting negative feedback all the time, or because it's not being reinforced, never gets a path, or doesn't get the right path, gets the wrong path because the reinforcement comes in the wrong way. Maybe they're reinforcing their own sense of, I've done that wrong again. But if you can help them to keep developing that muscle, and that's what neuroplasticity, I think, is. That's how I heard it when I was talking to this brilliant paediatrician. If you keep giving him, yes, you've done that and it's brilliant, and then do it again and do it again, eventually it becomes a path. And that's how you're actually you're consciously creating new pathways rather than just allowing it to happen organically. So a neurotypical person, some of these things happen organically, and somebody whose brain doesn't organize itself, can't access the prefrontal cortex, like my child, it doesn't organize itself. You have to actually put it in place. And for me, so I'm constantly coaching and mentoring him. Didn't realize that until I started doing it in the workplace, that's what we were doing as parents. And it's a bit like that. You're kind of trying to set this constant feedback loop so those new pathways come up. And I thought it was just really interesting that's a method from a medical professional. So it's a truism. Not that I'm not saying that it isn't, Sarah, but do you know what I mean? It's seeing that coming together with adults. And actually people used to think that your brain stopped being plastic when you're about 23, and that's not the case. That's been proven that you can carry on. You have to stretch and challenge and do it quite consciously, but you carry on developing your brain all the way through your life.
Yeah.
So it really does work.
No, it's really powerful, and it's also really important within that context, kind of understanding the idea that our brains are sort of hardwired by our evolutionary biology to focus more on the fears and the challenges and the threats than they are to focus on the good stuff. We all know this in our day-to-day life, right? After we've had a meeting, what are we going to think? Oh, all the things that went wrong rather than all the things that went right. And actually, to your point there, Jude, it's really about, focusing on how you can wire those pathways, because when you have that kind of empowering knowledge that your brain changes on a day-to-day basis, behavior is not set, behavior changes constantly, and it's guided by those maps that we build. And there's a lot that we as individuals and we as leaders and mentors can do to help guide that kind of map building in other people's brains as well as our children's. I use it constantly with my kids too. You think about just something like learning how to play the piano. It takes a long, it's just a repeating a passage again and again and again until it becomes sort of more hardwired into the brain's biology. And then suddenly somebody can just play something really complicated. Not suddenly, after a lot of practice, you can do it, and then you can get on to the next thing. I'm conscious of our time, so I want to introduce you just to the final point before I let everybody go. Just give me a second. So the final point is about optimizing the brain. What are the conditions that you can create within your brain spa mentoring session, which really enables you to kind of optimize your mentees' brains to perform at their best? Now, you might think that I'm putting up this image because nature is good for the brain, and it is, absolutely. But actually the reason I'm putting it up is because of the SCARF. There's an acronym and a model that's been created by an amazing neuroscientist called David Rock, called the SCARF model. And he defines them. There are 5 things that are included in the SCARF model: status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. There's an entire talk here, and I actually do another workshop specifically about this, supporting teams to kind of develop the things that they need as a team to enable all of their brains to perform optimally. But the key thing to understand about this is when we cultivate these things in our working lives and in our lives generally, we move our brains towards a reward state, which is a state in which our brains are capable of performing optimally. When we don't have these things, we move our brain towards a threat state, which is linked to that amygdala hijack that I was talking about before, a condition in which your emotional brain is really aroused and you don't have the access to your rational thinking that actually you really need at a time of threat. It's just the way that we're hardwired. But there's one point that I'd really love to kind of talk about with you before I finish this talk today, and that's in relation to status, because it's really important in the mentoring relationship. Ultimately, unlike a coaching relationship or a peer-to-peer relationship, the mentoring relationship is different. There is a status differential between yourself and the person who you are mentoring, just by dint of the kind of leadership position that you hold in relation to them. So from the mentee's perspective, there's good and bad in this. The good bit is there's a certain cachet for them in terms of working with someone like yourselves who's got more experience than they have and more knowledge than they have. But the risky thing is that there are also, when you're around a high status individual, your mentee is more likely to be a bit more on their guard, to want to protect themselves around you from sort of looking like a fool, and they'll be watching you quite carefully to judge what you think of them, because their brain is primed to sort of care about status. They will be aware of that kind of status differential between both of you. So what can you do? What can you do about it? There are two ideas that I just want to introduce you to. The first one is playing your power down. There's an amazing book that's been written by a Stanford psychologist called Deborah Grunfeld, which is all about this idea. But she essentially says to reassure another human brain that they're not going to be judged, or they're not going to be judged harshly. One of the things you can do as somebody who's in a more high status position is play your power down. And one of the best ways of doing that is to tell stories, and stories that reveal your kind of vulnerability or your humanness, or the times when you've ballsed up, made mistakes, and what you've learned from them. Because I think it's very easy when you're in a sort of in the lower status person in the relationship to think, oh God, I've got to present myself well, I've got to come across well, because this person will be judging me or thinking about, potentially thinking about me negatively. So one thing you can really do is just, reveal stories about yourself, tell them about who you are. And I think this is something that we all sort of intuitively do. But when you know it from a sort of brain perspective, that you're encouraging your mentee's brain into more of a reward state, when you're sharing information about yourself that perhaps doesn't shine you in the most amazing light, that reveals that you're human, it will actually have a knock-on effect on that brain's capacity to think. And the second thing is praise. I think if I could just get a loud speaker at the moment and encourage leaders and managers to be praising their staff more, I would, because what I'm really witnessing from the workshops I'm doing and the coaching that I'm doing is so many people are really struggling with this level of isolation, this inability to judge how they're doing, how they're getting on, how their work is being appreciated or valued. And praise is such a powerful thing to the brain. They've actually put people inside brain scanners, and you know, something as simple as a computer generated form of praise. So somebody's playing a game on a computer and the computer just says good job to the person, and you can actually see the reward areas in the brain light up in reaction to that statement. So if a computer can do it, you know, think about the value of hearing human praise. And the thing to say about praise is, it, you know, the best praise comes when it's specific. It's very easy for all of us to say, oh, you've done a great job, or this was amazing, or well done on that. But praise really lands, particularly with an individual who's got a status differential to you. Praise really lands when you deliver it specifically and you give somebody a reason for it, so that all those that negative thinking in their brain can't be accessed, because they're like, no, this is a concrete reason why this person is praising me. Okay, I need to believe it. I'm just going to pop out a minute and just open up again and see what you thought, hearing about the importance there of status and how you can play to it in the mentoring relationship.
Sarah, more a question from me.
Yeah.
Would you recommend an approach, particularly in that first meeting with your mentee, to kind of sort of remove that almost that status differential? Would you recommend anything you can engage in?
I think that the best advice that I can give, I don't know if anybody's heard of somebody called Brené Brown. She's an American scientist, and she's an American social researcher, and she's done a lot of research into the kind of power of vulnerability. And I think that the key thing I'd say is, like, before you even get to what's the goal, like, talk about yourself as an individual, talk about your experiences, encourage them to talk about what's going on for them. And then, you know, just inject a few comments. I don't want to be prescriptive about this, obviously, but just inject a few comments about you and what's gone wrong for you, as well as what's gone right for you, because it's those stories, it's that relatability factor. When someone sees you as another human being, as opposed to someone with a senior leadership role, they will be more prone to feel they can share information with you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. That makes sense.
That's okay. Has anyone got any other comments? Does it sound strange, or does it sound completely logical?
Sounds
completely logical.
Yeah.
It's logical, but it's a vulnerable space. So I've done quite a lot of what you may call oversharing with my team over the summer, when particularly sort of the early stages of lockdown, when I was feeling very frightened, and sharing, you know, how I was feeling, what was going on for me with my team. And sometimes I get off a call and think, oh, Jesus, you know, they're going to have no respect for you, and you're supposed to be the leader, and you're supposed to be being positive and all of that. But particularly because I was new to the team, thankfully, it did work. And there's a level of trust, I think, that comes with that. And people do ring me just for 5-minute chats here, there. And I had somebody ring me with something really important yesterday that they didn't feel they could talk about. And I took a big sigh of relief. Oh, thank God they feel that I am approachable, despite only having ever met me in person twice. So I've been beating myself up about doing that, but actually taking a bit of a step into the unknown and being slightly uncomfortable, that has helped. So, yeah.
And research really backs that up, that actually what people need, and especially in a work from home context at the moment, is they need to hear other people's stories, other people's vulnerabilities, because it makes, you know, we're all finding it tough, right? It's not easy operating from inside the same four walls all the time. We are not getting the answers to the questions that we would ordinarily get just out day-to-day banter with our peers. We're kind of operating much more in a vacuum, and sort of actually having somebody who's more senior than us, you know, sharing a vulnerability is actually, I think, a sign of strength rather than a sign of weakness, and something that we can all use with our teams on a day-to-day basis.
Sarah, I have a question in the last 5 minutes, which is quite a big question. So maybe we can, if we don't get to answer it. So a lot of the fact, obviously this is a program for female leadership, and there's been a lot of debate about female, you know, whether you class it's the female brain and the male brain or not, but there is a tendency, it is a sweeping statement, but a tendency for men to be more negative about themselves or less confident, because a lot of the things that have come out through the group already is about confidence, imposter syndrome, about people really feeling that. And Dominique, you've heard those conversations as well, haven't you? And that really has resonated. How, is there a way that a mentor, male or female, can really help their mentees to help their brain to move past that piece as well? With the practice.
It's a really big question, and I think there's
3 minutes to go. Sorry.
But I think there's lots you can do in terms of normalizing it. I think generally, although imposter syndrome is something that's talked about a lot, people tend to think that they're the only one who's feeling this way. They're aware of it as a concept, and they're aware it might apply to them, but they don't realize quite how many people experience it. And I think even, if it's something you've experienced, it's playing back to the same point, but sharing that with them. When I started this job, I felt like this, and I really struggled to know whether I was doing the right thing. But through a process of trial and error, I got to that point. And it's that the brain loves the story, absolutely loves the story. And when you can share one of your stories with somebody about the challenge you faced, how you tackled it and how you overcame it, it can be really valuable for other people. I could go on pages about this, by the way, but that's my first top level answer.
I also think that people assume that those feelings will go away when you get more senior. And I think I found with some of the younger people mentor that saying to them, actually, when I go into a big boardroom and I know that I'm going to be faced with, some big consulting challenge and it's going to be really tough, I can have a big gulp and I have to put my brave, a hat on to go in and do it. It doesn't, just because you get more senior and more experience, it doesn't go away. And I think that they seem to found that quite helpful. They're quite surprised that you still feel like that, even though you've got to a certain level or had certain experiences. And
it's so important. We only see how other people behave. We don't see how other people think.
Yes.
That's one of the things you can do as a mentor, is share what you actually think. So they're seeing something beyond what they're witnessing. And that's so valuable. I'm conscious of everybody's time, so I just want to quickly go back to kind of summarize what we've gone through. So what we've covered, I sort of introduced you to this idea of mentoring as like a brain spa, time to kind of rejuvenate the brain and step away from the kind of always on work culture that we're involved in. The benefits of really shining a spotlight on one thing at a time, of sort of stepping back and exploring the bigger picture and allowing our brain to sort of make those looser connections between different parts of our brain. I talked about neuroplasticity and how we can how we can think of ourselves as mentors, like thinking partners. So really helping to support the learning of other people. And finally, just that word of warning about the kind of status relationship in the mentoring arena, and what you can do to kind of reassure your mentee's brain so that they're in a place where they feel able to share with you safely. So just before I go, I just want to tell you a quick couple of things about what I do in case it could be relevant to you and your teams. I run a lot of training programs. So I've recently been running a kind of brain insights program about supporting teams in a work from home environment. And it really covers a lot of the content that we've talked about today, but it's all about sort of boosting well-being and performance. I've given the talks to lots of teams now, including teams at Shell and MasterCard, and what they're saying is really valuable is that kind of collective experience of people being able to sort of come together and talk about what's going on for them, what's working for them, and how they could use the brain insights to start working better together as a team. I also do a lot of training for leaders as coaches, so teaching people how to develop the skills they need to coach their teams and their peers. And then I do one-to-one coaching too, so supporting high-performing individuals or people who have got a specific challenge that their company wants me to come in and support them with. So if you'd like to connect with me, I'll just give you all my details here. They'll be included in the slides that you can take away at the end of the talk. But if we've got 1 minute, hang on, let me just unshare. Could everybody just give me a quick one line about what they're going to take away from the session today? What's been the most valuable thing for them? If I go to Jane.
Creating the space to really concentrate on this for me.
Wonderful. And Stuart?
It was around the neuroplasty and helping to kind of build those pathways or facilitate building those pathways.
Yeah, great. Sarah? Sorry, I feel like a school teacher going.
No, that's fine. No, that was the biggest light bulb for me, and really, so to make sure that your my natural tendency is to kind of get in and solve problems, but to balance that with reflecting on the good things, the things that the individual's already doing really well.
Yeah.
Key for me.
And Dominique?
Yeah, I think it was the kind of the same as Jane, really, the sort of press pause, that moment to just step back and you know, get your brain thinking in a different way was really powerful for me.
Lovely. And Jude?
I really liked what you were saying about uncovering people's unconscious bias of their own limitations. I think there's, if we could just unlock that, people would be, yeah, operating at a different level.
Yeah, absolutely. And Rack?
A couple of things for me is the stepping back piece is really, really important, and the power of stories, really, you know, using that as a tool to help the mentee progress. Yeah,
Wonderful. I'm really conscious of time, that I've run ever so slightly over, so just want to say thank you so much, everybody. It's been a real pleasure talking to you today, and good luck with the mentoring. I hope it goes really well.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you again. It's been really impactful, and I know the guys on the programme are they're loving every minute of it, is the feedback we're getting. So I look forward to hearing your feedback about how it's going in a little while. So thank you again.
Right.
Have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye.